And so we need to really break this constant cycle of logic that the Democrats are the best we can do, because that logic, that lesser evilism logic, is yet again allowing the Democrats to abandon all forms of struggle in an incredibly important moment where there are over 500 bills proposed, anti-trans bills proposed this year alone,
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. We're only halfway through 2023, and Republican legislatures across the US have proposed 560 anti-trans bills, of which 80 have passed. This is a lot. To put it into perspective, in all of last year, 2022, 174 anti-trans bills were proposed, and 26 of those passed. So in 2023, we are already up to over 3 times as many anti-trans bills. These bills and laws include bans on gender-affirming care for young people. They allow or even require trans students to be misgendered. They include drag bans. There are so-called Don't Say Gay laws, most infamously in Florida under Governor Ron DeSantis. These Don't Say Gay laws prevent teachers from even discussing gender, sexuality, and they even seek to ban certain books. There are also bathroom bills, which is a bit of a deja vu for people who recall North Carolina back in 2016. And these bills prevent people from using the bathroom that aligns with their gender. And then there are also bans on trans kids competing in sports. On the right, these proposals have come hand in hand with really extreme rhetoric. To provide just one example of this, at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference this year, one political commentator said, quote, "Transgenderism must be eradicated." But it's really important to keep in mind that transphobia and the attacks on trans rights are not limited to the far right or to Republican politicians, even though these are some of the most extreme, high-profile instances. What we're also seeing is a liberal version of anti-transness, particularly from bourgeois press outlets like the New York Times and The Atlantic. These liberal anti-trans sectors don't go as far as to support extreme measures like, for example, the Don't Say Gay bills, but they do say that the transgender movement has gone too far. These anti-trans sectors couch their concerns as so-called gender skepticism. They say they are just asking questions. And these questions are, of course, around, for example, young trans people receiving gender-affirming care or trans athletes being allowed to compete in sports. The idea here in the liberal anti-trans movement is that the left has become too radical, and we are pushing people to the right and into the Republican Party. So why are these attacks on trans people escalating? What is actually behind them, particularly from the right? A key explanation that we discuss in the episode today is around neoliberalism, or more specifically, the crisis of neoliberalism. So, neoliberalism, just to give a brief overview, developed as a result of the crisis of capitalist growth in the 1970s. And neoliberalism is associated with attacks on living and working conditions, as well as on unions. We've really been in an era of austerity, deregulation, financialization, debt, and precarious work. These are the things that characterize capitalism today, and of course increasingly over the past several decades. At the same time, and here I promise to come back to trans rights instead of giving an economics lesson, this neoliberal era was blanketed in pro-diversity rhetoric, especially from the Democratic Party. There was talk of empowerment and multiculturalism. Queer people, women, and people of color won key victories and were promised progress. But they were promised progress within the confines of capitalism and neoliberalism. In other words, to use feminist Nancy Fraser's terminology, and we'll discuss her more during this episode, we were in an era of progressive neoliberalism. Progressive movements like, say, lean in feminism or like corporate feminism lend a sort of charisma to the lethal neoliberalism that I described before, a sort of nice facade. These movements serve the ruling class while containing the illusions of workers and the oppressed. And when it came to rainbow capitalism, queer people were a new profitable market for companies to tap into. Social movement leaders also played a major role here. They supported the Democrats, all while these very same politicians were instituting policies that disproportionately harmed workers and the oppressed. For example, while Democrats famously kneeled wearing kente cloth in 2020 and painted Black Lives Matter on the streets, they were, of course, cracking down on protests and giving even more funding to police and to the military. And while just in the past couple of weeks, Joe Biden has posed with the pride flag, he is doing pretty much nothing to protect the queer and trans people facing horrific anti-queer legislation. This is progressive neoliberalism. But as I mentioned earlier, and as we've talked about on this podcast and also written about on our website, neoliberalism is in crisis, opened by the 2008 recession. We're seeing inflation, distrust in government institutions, mass inequality, crumbling infrastructure, crises of care and social reproduction, ecological devastation, even more precarious working and living conditions, etc. And this is what anti-establishment Republicans are rejecting. In other words, they're rejecting these neoliberal attacks, but they're also rejecting the empty progressivism that came with it. To quote Nancy Fraser again, to Trump voters in particular, quote, "Feminists and Wall Street were birds of a feather," unquote. Both Republicans and Democrats are trying to capture these disillusioned voters. The deeply divided Republican Party is trying to unite its different sectors, like the Trumpist sectors and the more establishment sectors, and they're attempting this unity under a battle against so-called wokeism. To quote Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, "Florida is where woke goes to die." The Democrats, in a sort of contradictory way, are trying to present themselves as the lesser evil on social issues, but they also have to accommodate this offensive against trans people. Today I'm joined by my comrades from Left Voice, Reba Landers and Enid Brain. Reba is a queer teacher and child care worker, and Enid is a trans woman and activist. They both are based in New York. Enid, Reba, and I are going to go into much more depth on the topics that I've mentioned already. And importantly, we are going to discuss what the tasks are for us as leftists when it comes to protecting trans rights and oppressed people. Also importantly, as Reba and Enid explain, Democrats are not our friends in the fight for trans rights. Instead, we need to unite our struggles in the streets and in our workplaces and fight for a working class party with a socialist perspective. Also, as a little bonus, listen to the very end of this episode to hear us discuss our favorite Pride-related movie. As a final reminder, we are a volunteer-run podcast and publication, so if you can, we'd appreciate your support at patreon.com/leftvoice. Please leave us a nice little review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Make sure to follow us on social media. We are left_voice on both Instagram and Twitter, and recently on TikTok. Here's my conversation with Reba and Enid. Enid and Reba, happy Pride and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here. Happy Pride, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, best month of the year. You have both written a lot about transphobia, trans rights, and the attacks on trans rights, so I'm really excited to have you both on today. And what you've pointed out is that there are attacks that are coming, obviously, both on the one hand from the far right and on the other hand from the Democrats, or kind of a more liberal wing of politics. But I wanted to start this conversation by digging into the attacks that are coming from the far right in particular. So I'm thinking the attacks that go as far as, for example, like banning trans affirming care for minors, or in some cases, even for adults, and the kinds of attacks that are taken up, especially by Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and his war on woke, using air quotes here. So, kind of a big question here. Why are Republicans and the far right taking up this attack on trans people, especially in recent years?
Yeah, I think that's a really central question, because I think there's this tendency sometimes to feel like these sort of attacks are just organic, if that makes sense. Is that like at some point people just wake up and start hating trans or queer people or immigrants or what have you? And I think obviously these attacks are systematic and systemic, but that doesn't mean that they're organic. And so it's important to sort of differentiate where these are coming from. And in the current moment, I really think that the far right's attacks on this have a lot to do with the internal crises of the Republican Party. And, I've been on this podcast before. We've discussed a lot the crisis of the Republican Party post Trump, but I think it kind of can't be overstated how disruptive Donald Trump was to the Republican Party. And so post 2020, the Republicans have been trying to find a way to orient themselves out of this crisis with keeping the base that Trump brought into the party and mobilized, but with also distancing themselves from Trump. This is a thing we've written about on the website as Trumpism without Trump, right? And this is a big problem for them because you have all of these different wings of the conservative movement, some of which are sort of traditional parts of the Republican Party, like evangelicalism, et cetera. And then some of these are sort of new sectors that have been brought into the Republican Party by Trump. And so the thing that they are trying to look to unify these different wings is attacks on the specially oppressed and specifically trans people. And I was looking back recently at some of our coverage, and after the 2021 Virginia governor's election, we wrote a lot about the Glenn Youngkin campaign in Virginia and how Glenn Youngkin, who is this sort of ultra reactionary Trumpism without Trump sort of figure, who was the first person to win a major election after the 2020 election and did so by beating Hillary Clinton's former chief of staff, a big, I believe he used to be the chair of the Democratic Party, and was able to defeat him, even though this Democratic candidate was much better funded, by mobilizing, fears around quote unquote critical race theory and then trans kids in schools. And the sort of theory that we put forward after that was that this is going to be a strategy for the Republican Party going forward, is that this is a way to bring together all the different wings of the Republican Party, unite them under something that they can agree on, and also begin to show rhetorical, if not necessarily political, breaks with neoliberalism, right? And so a huge part of the reason why Donald Trump was able to gain victory was to some extent by running against the establishment, by running against, these decades of neoliberalism. And obviously, Donald Trump was no progressive. Donald Trump was not a break with neoliberalism inherently, but his rhetoric was. And so this created a bunch of the problems of the Republican Party where they don't really want to walk away from neoliberalism because that's kind of like the ideology they've been implementing for decades now, right? And so by specifically trying to go against the progressive elements of neoliberalism, what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism, where neoliberalism brought more sectors of the oppressed into the mainstream for a whole variety of reasons, one of which being to make themselves look better as a political project, another one being the ability to expand markets and start to sell to people right now, right? Like a thing I always think about is in New York, there are non-binary clothing shops, quote unquote, as if all clothing is not inherently non-binary, right? But so the inclusion of these members of these sectors of the oppressed allows for markets to open. And so the Republican Party is trying to orient themselves against those elements of it as a way of trying to demonstrate a deeper break with this political project than they've actually had. So we think about DeSantis' war on woke, right? Where he says that Silicon Valley Bank collapsed because they were too woke, that Disney's a woke corporation, right? And what this allows him to do is seem like an opponent of the establishment while actually putting forward very establishment-centric politics. And it also allows the Republican Party to run against key sectors of the Democratic Party coalition, specifically in the economy, right? So it allows them to run against the Silicon Valley. It allows them to run against the entertainment industry, right? It allows them to run against these companies and these institutions which are major funders of the Democratic Party. So it allows the Republicans to present themselves as being somehow more disruptive than they actually are while keeping the sort of Trumpist base connected without having to sort of push them away. And so then the attacks on trans people then allows the Republican Party to hold itself together in a moment of sort of deep political crisis where they don't really have agreement. And the last thing I'll say, and I quote this all the time to anyone who talks to me personally, but I think the most clear example of this is the night that Ron DeSantis announced he was running for president. He was on Fox News, and Fox News asked him, "What do you think about the war in Ukraine?" And he said, "Well, the first thing we need to do is get gender ideology out of the military." Right. And so that's obviously not an answer to his position on Ukraine, but that shows us that the Republican Party is divided on Ukraine. There's not agreement within the Republican Party about what to do. And so they're attempting to sort of cover up these political differences in order to try and beat Biden in I almost said the fall, next fall. It's already election season, kids. But it allows them to sort of put forward the mirage of a politics without actually having to deepen their political agreement when there's a lot of dissent within the party between the Trumpist base and other elements.
Yeah, I find this association with neoliberalism so fascinating, or what you and Nancy Fraser is one who's written a lot about this. I'll link to one of her articles in the notes, progressive neoliberalism. I see why from the sort of like upper levels of like from the top of the Republican Party, why this would be helpful in terms of like finding something unifying when there's so many divisions. But could you say a little bit more about why this is so electorally successful? Because I think that we do have to also admit that, yes, it's effective from the upper echelons of Republicans, but there also is kind of a grassroots far right anti-trans hatred. Like, why do you think this can still resonate among people who are not like leaders in the Republican Party, but are maybe Republican voters?
I was just thinking about this need to sort of activate a base, right? Like to activate a voter base, and why this idea of progressive neoliberalism and breaking with the progressive bit has become so important. And I think that the Republican Party specifically, but also just both parties of capital, have a long tradition of trying to convince the working class that they can somehow work for them, right? That they somehow can be different this time. And in order to do that, they have to erase their own crimes. They have to erase the ways they've hurt the working class. And in order to do that, they have to blame someone else. And so when we think of progressive neoliberalism and the crisis that people are having with neoliberalism, the parties of capital benefit from emphasizing the progressive part and not the neoliberalism part, right? They don't want to have to roll back these ultimately beneficial for capital policies that don't fund people, that don't fund the working class, that don't have social programs at the heart of them. They want to keep that neoliberalism piece up, but they need to somehow show that they're breaking a pattern, right? And so instead of saying neoliberalism was the enemy and the way that we funded the economy, the way the policies that we passed, that's what got the working class to where it is. We need to say the parties of capital need to say that it's the progressive part. And so they find themselves in this situation where the working class is sort of in crisis right now, right? Like Donald Trump's phrase of draining the swamp was very activating for a lot of people, and got a lot of pull from people who maybe even people who voted Obama, we saw vote for Donald Trump, because this drain the swamp rhetoric was so effective. And it's so effective because people feel the crisis. They feel sort of the squeeze. And so the parties of capital are like, okay, they're in crisis. Crisis needs a response that offers some change. And so rather than changing the neoliberalism part, it's better for these parties of capital to change that progressive part. And I think not to shift away from the far right so soon, but I think that's why we see, Barack Obama had that like really sneaky line in an interview. I'm forgetting who he was interviewing with, but he basically said wokeness had gone too far, right? And so even the more liberal sectors of these parties of capital are trying to sneak into this situation where they can break from progressive neoliberalism without breaking from neoliberalism. And so they have to break with the progressive bit, and then they find themselves in this song and dance where they have to activate very specific bases around very specific topics to not seem bigoted, to not isolate more left-leaning folks. And I think the trans issue is something that can really effectively activate a lot of different people, because it's something that hasn't been super talked about. It hasn't been as, as much as something like gay marriage or the civil rights movement. Those are things that you can't activate a base around anymore, right? Because we've been talking about them for so long, that they've been they've had these movements associated with them, and they've been so sort of successfully integrated into society, and specifically capitalist society, that you can't activate a base around that as much as you can activate a base around sort of a trans panic, because people understand transness less, right? And so in order to break from this idea of progressive neoliberalism, because people are in crisis, when choosing between progressive and neoliberalism, they're going to break from the progressive bit before they're going to break from that neoliberalism bit, which ultimately serves the parties of capital.
I think what Reba was saying is really central. When we think about who are they trying to activate around this, it comes down to like a lot of very like key electoral questions, right? That political scientists and others have been talking about for a long time, which is this like all important swing voter, right? And there are a lot of political scientists who write about how if you look at the way like elections used to work, there used to be these like sweeping victories and sweeping mandates, right? Of like Ronald Reagan won 49 states, right? And that's just not the situation we're in anymore, where every like Joe Biden won pretty handily and it was still relatively close, you know what I mean? And so in that sense, it becomes all about these swing voters, right? The Obama Trump voters that Reba was talking about. And if we look at where these folks are, a lot of the sort of most contested demographics are in the suburbs, right? And so it gets into this question of like, who is the imagined suburban voter? And the imagined suburban voter is often, a white college educated mom who just, is worried about her kids, move to the suburbs to raise her kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then a lot of this trans panic is around this sort of question of the child, right? And of the trans child. And so then it becomes, all of these attacks are almost always focused to some extent on like, we're trying to protect your kids. We're trying to protect your kids from the evil transsexual fairy who's coming to convert them to transness. We're trying to protect them from trans kids in their schools. We're trying to protect them from trans adults, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so it comes into this question of trying to win and mobilize the suburban voter around these sort of imagined middle class issues of child rearing and education and things like that. It's the same thing we see with critical race theory, right? Of this idea of, I've talked about this before, but there was a school board candidate in North Carolina where I'm from who ran in the last election with the slogan, give the schools back to the parents. And like that, I thought was a really like amazing sum up of like what the whole right wing proposal is right now, right? Is that we're trying to like recenter the parent, recenter the nuclear family. But I think that the other important thing to sort of talk about with this is that there is this like key contradiction of this anti-trans movement, which is that poll after poll after poll are showing that like the public by and large supports trans rights. A majority of people are not subscribing to this anti-trans panic. And so it's less about trying to mobilize the majority of the masses, but trying to mobilize a very specific sector of it. And so this is like a really key political contradiction that I think we're seeing how far this can go, right? And I think the question of whether or not DeSantis making anti-transness the center of his political campaign is going to be able to become a major figure in the Republican Party and able to win the nomination right now. It looks like there are some limits to that. And I think part of those limits are this is an effective strategy on the state level to some extent of mobilizing specific sectors of the state, but not necessarily as effective on a national level, though obviously that's still to be seen.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I think it's also worth being a little bit more specific about like what we mean by, as Reba was saying, working people feeling the squeeze. So there's this deep crisis of capitalism and neoliberalism, which takes the form of repeated crises, like most emblematically perhaps in the financial crisis of 2008, and lower living standards across the board, stagnant wages, inflation, austerity after austerity after austerity, and then also the attacks on oppressed people in this context. So we are not at the so-called end of history where things are just getting better and better and better for everyone because we embraced neoliberalism. So there's this broad rejection of neoliberalism, which also came with a rejection of these social elements that you've both been talking about. So, in a sense, the attacks on trans rights are a rebellion against rainbow capitalism. Can you talk a little bit more about what progressive neoliberalism looks like, and also what these crises of neoliberalism look like?
Thinking about progressive neoliberalism, and the article by Nancy Fraser is really, really fascinating to me, and one I think about a lot. It sort of describes this move towards progressivism as, how many women are in the Fortune 500, right? And how many Black CEOs are in the United States. And, uh, they can be openly gay people, really climbing the corporate ladder and really focusing on things that are ultimately like very capitalist, versions of success, but they include minorities, right? And obviously that leaves out enormous, like the vast majority of trans people, of queer people, of women and Black people are working class, right? Like the vast majority of people are not helped by there being a Black woman CEO in the Fortune 500, for example, right? Like that's not doing anything for us on a systemic level. But they get to point to it and say that things are getting better. And what's fascinating to me is there is sort of this push and pull of trans people being the most visible they've ever been and sort of the most celebrated in media, and the most horrific attacks on trans people like in modern history. So we've got these situations where like a trans woman comes to the White House and interviews Joe Biden, right? But can't speak in public in like many southern and midwestern states. So I think that really just sort of showcases the contradictions of what these parties of capital are trying to do, and the contradictions of this like idea of progressive neoliberalism as sort of a way out. And so we end up with a situation where these trans people are vocal, they get platforms if they've made themselves successful enough, if they've made themselves appealing enough or acceptable enough to capital. So a trans woman can't go to, the one that's coming to mind is Montana, right? Montana, Zoe Zephyr is, an elected official in the Democratic Party, but can't even go to the sessions and speak. But a trans woman has gone to the White House. Dylan Mulvaney went to the White House and spoke with Joe Biden, right? And it's because she made, she became sort of a figurehead of trans acceptability. But that doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't really mean anything for the rest of us. And it just sort of becomes a situation where the Democrats and sort of the center play this song and dance where they have just enough evidence that they're not transphobes while not doing anything and actually actively progressing a transphobic agenda. But they have to have these figureheads. They have to have these, sort of things they can point to. And this is such a key facet of progressive neoliberalism. And Nancy Fraser talks about Hillary Clinton being such a key figure for progressive neoliberalism, because it was like, look at this woman who's breaking the glass ceiling. But she's Hillary Clinton, right? Like she's not good for women. She's not good for the working class. She has such a horrific track record of just I mean, we can't spend enough time on this podcast talking about all the problems with Hillary Clinton, right? But they got to point to her and say, look,
Profoundly anti-worker, for example.
no, completely. But they get to point to her and say, like, look how progressive we've become. And, this happened with Obama as well. And this is just such a key facet of progressive neoliberalism. And so we're seeing this contradiction of like rainbow capitalism thriving more than ever, but also such an activated base around anti-trans issues. And this interesting song and dance of trying, we can see Democrats especially trying to navigate this contradiction with progressive neoliberalism and having, for example, trans speakers elevating trans voices. I've seen Joe Biden in interviews. It says Joe Biden, he, him, which is hysterical to me, because then he's advancing these like bananas transphobic laws, right? Or at least not stopping them. So it's interesting that this sort of contradiction exists between rainbow capitalism really thriving and just like the worst attacks we've ever seen on trans people.
Yeah, something I want to add to that is that I think a huge part of this crisis of neoliberalism, which is like a multifaceted crisis, right? It's a crisis economically, right? Post 2008. It's a crisis ideologically, like we've been talking about. People just like don't fuck with it anymore as much, right? And also like this like political crisis of, I always think about how like at the onset of neoliberalism, Margaret Thatcher, one of the like prominence of it, said in the UK, there is no alternative. And like more and more people on both the right and the left, this is not purely a progressive phenomenon, but more and more people are like, there needs to be an alternative, let me go and find one. Be that, you know, Trump's right-wing populism, or Bernie Sanders's, you know, social democracy, or obviously, you know, we're revolutionary Marxists, that's our alternative, right? But I think like a key part of the crisis of neoliberalism is the resulting crisis of social reproduction, right? And the crisis of social reproduction, you know, social reproduction being the labor of reproducing the working class, both literally through like childbirth and child rearing, and also, you know, making sure the home is taken care of, elder care, schooling, things like that. All of these things are in crisis under neoliberalism. And they're in crisis under neoliberalism because structurally neoliberalism forced people to work longer and longer hours for less and less money, which put huge strains on the nuclear family, which is a key element of capitalist reproduction. And then also injected, you know, this is less because of neoliberalism and more because of like the way society emerged, but injected the internet, which is this incredibly like vibrant way of accessing information somewhat quote unquote freely. At the same time, they were defunding schools and straining the nuclear family. And so now we're in this moment where both the family and the school are less central to children's and young people's sort of formation as ideological and political creatures than it has been before. And so, in that sense, I think a lot of the attacks on trans identity and specifically trans youth are about attempting to sort of reassert, and many times explicitly, reassert the centrality first of the family and then of the school as the place in which this reproduction happens, right? And so it's all about, you know, children shouldn't be able to, you know, even dress differently at school without their parents' explicit permission, right? It's about, you know, parents should be able to decide what their kids learn about history. Parents should be able to decide all of these things, and not in like the way that we as socialists would argue the curriculum should be set by the community and the teachers, right? But in this very reactionary way of, I don't want my child learning about slavery, right? I don't want my child learning about queer identity. I don't want my child learning about all these things, right? And so this idea of recentering the nuclear family is a hyper reactionary response, but still a response and an attempted solution at this crisis of social reproduction that is a direct result of the crisis of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism strained the nuclear family, not to the breaking point, because obviously nuclear families still exist, but like we're seeing a declining birth rate, we're seeing a declining marriage rate, people are having children less and later, people are getting married less and later, right? And all of these things are in part because our conditions are so bad, right? And, you know, especially among like younger people, there's this real feeling because of the economy, because of the climate, because of all these things of like, well, maybe we just shouldn't have children, right? And as we think about how the US is orienting itself toward the coming period and the competition with China being so central with that, there's something that people have written about as like I think it's called the generation bomb, right? That there's this moment where a bunch of the US, you know, the baby boomer, the Gen X generation is about to retire, and they need somebody to replace those workers. They need more people. And there's a issue with getting that number of people, right? And so this plus this idea of like, how do we make sure that like these young people who are increasingly politicized, and, you know, as we're seeing, and I think we're going to talk about this later, but like we're seeing young people and especially young queer people on the vanguard of a lot of struggles, be that BLM, be that the defense of the queer movement, be that the union drives that we're seeing, etc. But we're seeing this attempt to sort of restrain this youth organizing and this youth development by recentering the family and then sort of strengthening the right-wing control over schooling. And I think all of these are connected to the crisis of social reproduction, which is then in turn connected to the crisis of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism, to very many extents, created the crisis of social reproduction we're seeing right now.
I think about the nuclear family a lot and the sort of crisis of reproduction, and specifically the way this sort of harping on the nuclear family and family values and quote unquote parents' rights that's become really prominent really removes the autonomy of children. And these stats that we keep talking about, like recently I've read that like 2/3 of Americans don't support these anti-trans attacks. But I do wonder about people who maybe in that survey said, no, they don't support the anti-trans attacks, but what about the children, right? Like that sort of tends to be like a rider to what people say as far as like pro-trans opinion. And I'm thinking specifically about a really shocking example, but there's this unfortunately popular book called Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, and the subtitle is The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. And she's specifically attacking trans masc people. And what's most fascinating to me is that in the introduction to her book, she very explicitly says that she is not transphobic, I'll be the judge of that one, first of all. But she says, I'm not transphobic. I'm not opposed to the idea of trans people. And she very specifically says, if a trans person I mention in this book is over 18, I will gender them correctly. If they are under 18, I will not. So she starts talking about these trans masked people, these trans boys who are under 18, and she misgenders them, misgenders them, misgenders them. And as soon as they're 18, as soon as she has deemed them, allowed to make their own decisions, she'll gender them correctly. And so this begs the question of like, at what age does somebody get body autonomy, and why are these people so obsessed with this idea that children can't make decisions for themselves? And I think that really speaks to like how deeply ingrained the nuclear family and like parents' rights are into capitalist society, right? Like this speaks to the crisis of social reproduction. And again, the parties of capital really benefit not from pointing out the financial, like material reality of why we're having this crisis of social reproduction. Like Enid was saying, like our conditions are worse. How are people going to have the kids that the birth rates that they used to have when they can't afford a home, they can barely make ends meet? It makes a lot of sense that we're seeing a crisis of social reproduction if we consider those financial material conditions. But the parties of capital can't address those without fixing something, and it's not beneficial for them to let the working class have better material conditions, right? So they focus on there's a war on parents, things are getting too woke, schools want to indoctrinate your kids. And this works not only on people who lean more right, but on people who consider themselves to be more center and even more left leaning. I think all the time about these two New York Times articles that I wrote a response to for our site that really gave a lot of space to this idea of like being gender skeptical.
We're just asking questions.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, I'm not transphobic, but these are kids and I'm just asking questions, and how much can they really know? And like Enid was saying, that with the rise of the internet, people love to blame this social contagion idea, right? Like, oh, my kid just like saw another person being trans and decided to be trans. And, in my opinion, if you saw a person being trans and then were trans, you were trans already and you just needed to see someone to understand maybe what was happening for you. This quote from that article is from this parent of a child who was trans and came out at school before he came out to his parents. And this parent was very hurt by that. And he was like, well, all this is happening without my permission. And I'm a left leaning person. Like, I vote for Democrats, but suddenly I find myself in bed with like the governor of Texas. Like, suddenly the only person who's like listening to my concerns is Greg Abbott. And that just speaks so much to me about like, yeah, 2/3 of the US public is apparently against these anti-trans attacks. However, a lot of them make the exception when it comes to children, because we think of children as less than, we think of children as not able to make their own decisions, we think that they're misguided, when that's just like not really the reality, right? Like kids, and especially as they get into their teenage years, there's not just like some magical flip where they are able to make better informed decisions. Like, you don't wake up on your 18th birthday and suddenly know who you are so much better than you did when you were 17, right?
Yeah, this idea of liberals in particular just asking questions leads into something I wanted to ask about in terms of the transphobia and the attacks on trans rights that are coming from liberals. So we started this episode by talking about the far right and the super harmful laws and extreme rhetoric, but there are actually a lot of commonalities between the far right attacks and liberal attacks on trans rights, including what we see as the origins in terms of the crises of neoliberalism, the need to capture parts of the electorate, and things like that. Could you talk a little bit about what's behind the attack on trans rights from a liberal perspective? What do these attacks look like? And also, what do these attacks say about the Democratic Party?
Yeah, something I want to add on. I think there's a really like central discussion. But I think what's so fascinating to me about so much of just asking questions from the quote unquote left, right, the quote unquote center, is that it all relies upon this assumption that being trans is somehow a negative thing. Is that it implies this idea that like, well, you know what, we're supposed to let children just make decisions that will impact the rest of their lives. Well, going through quote unquote natural unquote puberty is also a permanent decision that can last the rest of your life, right? And so it's there's this inherent assumption that something about being trans is not desirable, right? That something about being trans is negative. And so therefore we need to make extra sure like that people are making all the decisions before they embark on that journey, instead of viewing sort of gender development as being, part of our right to bodily autonomy, part of our right to explore and define ourselves. If we sort of scratch the surface of these just asking questions pseudo liberals, right, we can see the like political logic of this, right? Is that if you're the Democratic Party and you're trying to control Congress and you're trying to control the presidency, you need the exact same vote as the Republicans are targeting with this anti-trans rhetoric. And so in I think what is like the perfect encapsulation of all the things, we say on this podcast, we say on the site, we say all the time, find us at the bar, we'll probably say it there too, of like why the Democrats aren't our friends and why the Democrats are our opponents, is that we can see that they are both explicitly and implicitly trying to walk their support of trans rights back to give more space to this sort of just asking questions phenomenon. And so Reba mentioned the Pod Save America interview that Obama did during the midterms last year. Last year? Yeah, last year. What year is it? Where am I? But who's to say? It's the estrogen. It corrupts your sense of time. That's a joke. Anyway, but that with this idea of like wokeness has gone too far, is that it's almost an exact echo of the thing James Carville said on CNN the night of the 2016 election, which is that trans bathrooms lost Hillary Clinton the election, which is an insane thing to think about if you think about like what Hillary Clinton was not making trans rights the center of her 2016 campaign. But it's this idea of like, well, quote unquote, the working class, whoever that is in this liberal conception, don't like trans people. They're, and it so speaks again to this image of the American worker as this like assumed white, assumed cisgender, assumed nativist, and assumed male figure in these parts of the country who are just, ultra reactionary and are just like walking around thinking about how much they hate queer people and trans people, right? And like, once again, we see from polling that this is not true. And so there's an attempt by the sort of ideological apparatus of the Democratic Party, such as the New York Times, right? And such as, these, interviews these leaders are giving, to sort of attempt to show a break with trans rights so that they can attempt to reclaim these people who they've lost. And so the line of the Democratic Party right now is the reason that they're not as successful as they want to be is not because of all of their betrayals, is not because of all of their contradictions on economic questions, is not because of the fact that their leaders are completely uninspiring. The reason why they're struggling is because they were too woke, they were too supportive of Black Lives Matter, they were too supportive of queer rights, they were too supportive of trans rights. And so when we talk about how like the Democrats are wolves in sheep's clothing, this is exactly what we mean, right? Is that when we are, a dynamic phenomenon, they're going to show up with fucking kente cloth, kneel on the ground and pretend that they support, the restructuring of the police, whatever the hell that means, and then suddenly when it's not politically beneficial, they become the party of law and order, and they become the party of we need to fund the police, right? And that was a big thing in the 2022 midterms of like, well, we need to become the party that is like pro funding the police. And so we can see from that, and we can see from the beginnings of what we're seeing on the trans question, of that like they're perfectly willing to shift away from any form of defense of the specially oppressed when it's politically beneficial. And so in that sense, as we think about how to defend ourselves from these attacks, we have to see that the Democrats, even though they aren't the ones proposing these laws, and in some cases, especially on the state level, there are some Democrats who are like really fighting these, we have to view all of that as just like performance art, because we can see that the orientation of the National Party is not around defense of the specially oppressed and never has been, right? We can go back to the civil rights movement and see the exact same thing that we saw with BLM and that we're seeing with the trans movement, right? Is they want to steal our slogans and get our energy when they can win them an election, but in the moment it seems like it may not be the most politically popular thing to do to support the specially oppressed, suddenly they're just following orders. You know what I mean? They're just asking questions or what have you. And so I think that like it's easy sometimes to like look at these like liberal publications like the New York Times, like the Atlantic, and all the other ones who are constantly posting these pseudo-liberal, pseudo-intellectuals who are wringing their hands about like, why are there so many transsexuals now? But like, that is not disconnected from the orientation of the Democratic Party. And what they're trying to do is give an ideological basis for a purely opportunistic shift away from taking up this question in an attempt to win votes. And so yet again, we're seeing the Democrats abandon our community when we are in our most need. And there comes a point where, as Maya Angelou famously said, when someone tells you who they are, believe them, right? And the Democrats are yet again telling us who they are. So I think we got to start believing them, that they don't give a fuck about trans rights. They don't give a fuck about protecting us. They just want to, and they're perfectly happy to have the Republican Party as scary as possible. Because when it's Ron DeSantis versus basically whoever, many people are going to be like, well, I definitely don't want Ron DeSantis to be president. I definitely don't want Donald Trump to be president. So in fact, these incredibly reactionary shifts in the Republican Party are very beneficial to the Democrats, because it allows them to move towards the center and be slightly less reactionary while still holding on to huge sectors of our community and huge sectors of our supporters. And so we need to really break this like constant cycle of logic that like the Democrats are the best we can do, because that logic, that lesser evilism logic, is yet again allowing the Democrats to abandon all forms of struggle in an incredibly important moment where there are over 500 bills proposed, anti-trans bills proposed this year alone, you know?
And this idea of the Democrats not being as bad is not true at all. It's not holding water, not only in that they're not protecting us, but in that they're actively a negative force. And on a federal level, if Ron DeSantis or Donald Trump win the presidency, they have both promised to pass like federal level trans bans, right? Like bans on HRT, bans on social transition. They're coming for trans people at a federal level, at a national level. And Joe Biden has not said that he will protect HRT at a federal level, that he'll pass anything that guarantees everyone gets access to HRT. That he's not proposing any kind of protections at a national level. So essentially what we're saying, if we decide that Democrats are the best we can do, is it's okay if trans people in 25 or 30 states are not able to access healthcare, are forced back in the closet, are medically detransitioned by force, as long as the other 20 states are protected. So to me, it's just like you're okay with trans people suffering in Oklahoma as long as they don't suffer in New York, right? And that's exactly sort of the world that Democrats are proposing, is not like a nation where all trans people have access to the gender affirming care that they deserve and access to, for example, protections in schools, but that half of the nation gets it and the other half doesn't, right? Like they just sort of leave it up to the state level. And so it's not actually a protection, it's not actually moving things in a better direction. And we're currently under a Democratic presidency, and look how things are spreading, right? Like how is this the better option? Like there is another option besides this. And I also want to mention really quickly that I think on the trans question, it's easy to become very centered on just the national question and forget that there are trans people all around the world. And so how can we sort of in good conscience, or not to be too moralistic about it, but how can we logically say that Joe Biden is what's best for trans people when, for example, Joe Biden's immigration policy is more conservative than Trump's, right? Like his border crackdown is so intense. Just recently, like a trans woman was killed at the southern border of the US, right? Like at a detainment facility. And so if we're thinking about this only nationally, we find the flaw of, okay, 30 states are, you know, passing these horrible legislations about trans people, but the 20 states aren't. And also we're ignoring the whole rest of the world. Like, are we really saying that just 20 blue states is the best we can do? And I just don't think it is, right? Like, I don't think that the best thing that we can do is sort of shake our heads and wring our hands and then hold our nose and vote blue, right? And we're seeing this energy, especially from young people, especially from young queer people, not wanting to take it anymore, right? Like they don't remember a world of stability. They don't remember, like, I'm not even as young as some of the people we're seeing sort of at the front lines of these movements. And I don't really remember anything before the 2008 crisis, right? Like I came of age in that era where it was just like recession after recession after recession. And so they, especially people younger than me, don't know a world of stability. They don't know a world without, insane polarization. They don't know anything positive, really, that capitalism has ever given them. They've only seen the negative repercussions of capitalism. And I think they are looking for an alternative. And to give them only the alternative, or the supposed alternative of, well, we can only vote Democrat, is really a disservice. And I think it sort of funnels all this energy that we're seeing into the wrong spot, when what we really need to do is advocate for building, organs of self-organization completely independent from these parties of capital that have just been bankrupt time after time after time. These young people are not satisfied by and large with the answer of just vote Democrat. They're doing it, but they're holding their nose doing it. So we need to really seriously talk about how there is an alternative, and it's self-organization, right? Like, we can build a party outside of these parties of capital, and not just a party that gets elected to Congress and, goes down the AOC route where they just like get in there and start shifting, as we always say, rightward and upward. That's not our only option either, right? Like, we can build, we can organize together all of this energy that we've seen in the sort of what we call the Generation U phenomena, right? Like the people organizing their workplace, the people who are not just quitting a job and going to the next one and quitting a job and going to the next one, but staying and saying, actually, no job is serving me. No job is treating me well. I'm starting a union, which is exactly how I came to revolutionary socialism, right? Like, I had been in the workforce for 10 years at only 23 years old. And I was like, I'm tired of job hopping. I need a union. And so this energy, this passion, this unwillingness to accept the status quo anymore, it's a shame if we only funnel that into the Democratic Party, right? Because it's just a bankrupt spot. It's just a graveyard for social movements. And so all of this energy we see from young people, from Generation U, from people who are too young to even have jobs. Like, we've had experiences with like 13, 14, 15-year-olds who walk out of school to protest these anti-trans laws, right? And these people, I don't want them to just think that Democrats are the only answer when they have all this energy, they have all this passion. And the people who took the streets in BLM 2020, the largest social movement in American history, are still here too, right? And they were still saying abolish the police, which is an explicitly anti-capitalist phrase to put forward.
I think Generation U is a really interesting thing to dig into just a little bit more, because it's true that these people, like these young people, by the way, in case we haven't said it, Generation U, we see U as standing for union. So these young people who are leading unionization drives in places like Starbucks, Amazon, and places like that. So on the one hand, certainly these people are tired of, recession after recession, tired of these, contradictions of capitalism and how neoliberalism and the system is not offering them anything. But also, there is this way in which these workers also are playing a really big role in fighting against oppression and really seeing this link between exploitation and, for example, trans oppression. I was wondering if either of you could speak a little bit more to specifically the role that Generation U and young people have played in not, being, class reductionist and just being like, oh yeah, we're the working class and things have just gotten worse in our lifetime, but also the ways in which a lot of these people are really trying to also fight oppression and also show the fact that, the solution to problems that workers face is not to throw trans people under the bus or queer people or black people or immigrants under the bus, but actually it is to take up those struggles in a really serious way.
There's often been this idea that's been put forward that workers' rights and everything else are just completely separate, right? That like the role of worker organizations, of unions, is to just fight for sort of bread and butter demands in the workplace. And, we can have social stuff, or, really we should just be voting to fix everything else. And one, that idea is super backwards, right? Obviously, like, workers not only can, but they must fight for these things. And it's also completely ahistorical. And I was just thinking about my partner, who's been on the podcast a little bit, was texting me this morning about this book she's reading. And unions have been fighting on behalf of trans coworkers in the United States since at least 1975, right? Is one of the first recorded instances of a union fighting for trans rights, right? And like, that is really central, right? And I think that is what so much of the neoliberal era was trying to sort of cover up, is this cover up this idea that unions could be doing anything else other than, either not existing or just trying to get you a couple dollar pay raise. And this idea that the unions and that labor organizations can be used to fight for these other things is a logic that is increasingly becoming common with this Gen U phenomenon, right? And we see, the thing we always talk about is like the day that the Dobbs decision leaked, the Starbucks union tweeted out like a very explicit support of the abortion movement, and then like joined the marches, right? And on we're recording this a couple of days before Pride in New York City, and Left Voice organized a left and labor contingent to sort of go as like labor for trans rights, like the labor movement trying to defend the trans community against these attacks. And we were able to mobilize lots and lots of unions. We were like kind of pleasantly surprised by how many unions responded to our emails and were like, fuck yeah, we'll be there, right? And I think what we can see is that there's this energy among people who are increasingly, especially after the pandemic, especially after BLM, seeing how all of these things are connected. And I think that is a logic that is incredibly scary to capitalists in their state, right? That they really don't want us to start uniting our struggles and realizing that we need to fight for these things collectively. And I think we'll probably talk more about how we could see that developing and how we would like that to develop towards the end. But like this idea of, using our power as workers and using our power as organizers in the labor movement to disrupt production, to stop profits being made in order to fight for these things that we need, be they racial equality, gender equality, what have you. All of these things are a way of deepening our power, and deepening the fight against these attacks and the defense against these attacks, beyond just the sort of traditional, be that a sort of demonstration or be that voting or be that suing, right? And the idea of actually being able to like disrupt the capitalist system through strikes, through work stoppages, through all these things, which is a power that the labor movement brings us, is really, really scary to these capitalists. And so I think they're really scared of this new union phenomenon. They're really scared of the way that the new union phenomenon is linking up with these other struggles.
Yeah, I think in connecting what we see as sort of social issues, social movements, right, to labor, the trans question, I guess, the attacks on trans rights are a really great way to demonstrate the way that labor can fight for social movements, because trans people need access to a very specific type of healthcare, right? Like, not every trans person, but a lot of trans people want access to things like HRT, to gender affirming surgery, even to things like quality mental health care with a qualified professional. And these are things that are often in union contracts anyway, right? Like, unions are going to be fighting over healthcare anyway. So adding that piece of actually this has to cover trans healthcare too is a very easy way to sort of show, okay, you fought for trans healthcare, and healthcare is sort of more traditionally found in union struggles anyway. So now what if you took that farther and used the energy, the power of your union as a unit of self-organization to push beyond that, right? And so we start maybe at these fights for healthcare, but then especially we as leftists in these spaces can really intervene and help workers like push to the next conclusion, which is, okay, what if you walked out over these bills, right? Like, what if we shut down lines of profit? And I keep thinking, when I first I was sort of won to the idea of revolutionary socialism while I was unionizing in my workplace, and Enid, who was talking to me about this idea, was trying to connect sort of labor and social movements. And she was like, well, what if one of these states with these super anti-trans education attacks, what if these teachers unions decided to do something about it? What if they decided to, have a work stoppage over this until these bills were killed or overturned? And I was like, well, that wouldn't work. Why would that work? And she was like, well, what do they do if kids aren't going to school? That halts the entire economy of the state. It starts to cost them money. And so I think once workers start to realize, oh, we can make trans demands because trans healthcare can be part of our contract, then they start to go, well, what other fighting things can we do for the trans community? What other fighting things can we do for the specially oppressed? And I'm remembering also when the New York Times walked out quite recently, like in the winter, one of the key things that they were walking out over was that they felt that workers of color were getting harsher feedback from their bosses. They wanted in these sort of quarterly check-ins someone else present with these workers of color because they felt like there was a racial element at play. And that was a key reason they walked out. And so they had this work stoppage not just for pay, but because this social issue was sort of coming uh, to a head in their workplace. They were seeing these social issues in sort of a smaller scale in their workplace. And they decided, hey, we actually have power to walk out over this too. And it's exciting to see this growing phenomenon of people in places like Starbucks, like Trader Joe's, right? Unionizing and taking up specifically trans healthcare as a central demand. And the energy that these young people have put into unionizing, I think if we can really break from this idea that a worker is someone who wears like coveralls and it is a like a white guy who works in a warehouse, but like that a worker in the working class is the 21-year-old trans person who works at Starbucks down the street. That is the working class, right? So when we think about how does the working class fight for social issues, they fight for their own issues, right? And then they fight for their coworkers' issues. And so it's not so separate. And Enid was getting at this earlier, this idea of like one type of worker, one type of working class, and having to sort of like bend over backwards to like get them to care about social issues. The oppressed like sectors are largely working class, like they are the workers. And so it's exciting to see these young people taking up this unionization and taking up um, really the full power of what a union can do beyond just this sort of what we call like business union model, where you're just working contract to contract, trying to get minor raises or minor healthcare, benefits, but rather the fighting spirit of what a union can do. And I really hope that this phenomenon, sort of catches fire even more, and that we can kind of reclaim the labor movement of like the early 20th century, and see more like walkouts and work stoppages and mass strikes over social issues. And as we talk about having alternatives to the Democratic Party, these are ways that we help build alternatives too, right? Like using these organs of self-organization within the working class to actually shut down production, to hit capital where it hurts, by cutting off these profits. And I'm excited by young people who are sort of starting to wake up to that power, and I'm hoping that we can really like continue to lean into that.
I want to begin wrapping up a bit here by asking what I usually ask toward the end of a podcast episode, which is what the tasks are for the left. In this case, what we need to do from the perspective of fighting these reactionary attacks from the right, but also fighting the more liberal flavor of transphobia, for lack of a better term. What we need to do to ultimately protect trans people, protect trans kids, and overall fight for the oppressed. So you've both pointed out in this conversation, and we've written extensively about this, how liberals and the Democrats aren't our friends in general, and they definitely are not our friends in the fight for trans rights. Like you guys said, Democrats have done nothing to stop all the attacks that we've talked about today. They've paved the way for the rise of the right, and they only care about trans rights and also things like reproductive rights to the extent that it gets people to vote for them. I'm kind of answering my own question here, but why don't we encourage people to vote for the lesser evil? What is the alternative to holding our noses every couple of years and voting for the Democrats?
The Democratic Party is actively hurting us, right? Like the anti-queer moment that we're in didn't fall from the sky. It is the result of both parties advancing whatever was useful to them politically, and at moments that was absolutely anti-queer legislation. And I think it's important for us to realize, and I mean, for everyone who's sort of tempted by lesser evilism, to realize that this oversimplification that we think of Republicans are the bad guys and Democrats are the good guys, or at least the better guys, is just not true.
Yeah, something I wanted to to add to that, connecting sort of to what Reba was saying earlier as well about this like idea of the lesser evilism and the limits of that, is that there's this big sort of fear right now that I'm seeing from a lot of my trans friends, my trans comrades, etc., is that like whatever happens in the next election, it's over. And I think that's like one of the most insidious parts of lesser evilism, right? Is that it makes the defense of our rights and the defense against these attacks purely tied to the result of the election. When that's absolutely not the logic we should be putting forward right now. If Ron DeSantis wins the presidency, we need to start organizing like wildfire, right? And that's going to involve going to these unions and fighting in our own unions for like we need to like take a step for this, right? We need to get the unions willing and ready to strike for trans rights, right? If they try and pass a national trans ban, like every teacher needs to go on strike, right? All these healthcare workers need to go on strike, right? And that needs to join with this really combative social movement. And so there's this idea that I think is really pervasive in the US of like, in the words of Barack Obama, elections have consequences, right? That like, well, you lost the election, time to just sit back and let them do whatever to you. And that's like this incredibly bizarre logic, right? And that's not a logic that we're seeing around the world, right? And I keep thinking about France, and I believe a podcast episode was done on this, but like the really intense struggle in France around these quote unquote reforms to the pension put forward by Emmanuel Macron, right? And the workers and the people of France didn't just be like, well, elections have consequences, Macron can do whatever he wants. They were like, fuck no, we're shutting this shit down, right? And like that's the spirit we need here, and that's a spirit that like lesser evilism and that logic and this logic of like just hold your nose and vote for the Democrats is keeping from us, because it implies that that's the best we can do and that's the way we fight for it. And so to build off of what Reba was saying, we need to think about how to self-organize ourselves to defend this. And we need to think about how can we make sure that both not only in this moment of really acute attacks, but how can we maintain a fighting body so that the next time these attacks emerge, whether they are on the trans media or anybody else, right? We're seeing a lot of attacks emerge right now against immigrants, right? And against immigration. How do we join all of these different movements and all of these different unions together into one fighting force? And that's why like we as Left Voice are really sort of banging the drum right now that we need a working class party. We need a working class party that's going to fight for socialism, because this sort of whack-a-mole approach to organizing isn't getting us the power we need, right? Of just like fighting things as they emerge is burning everybody out. It's exhausting people and it's weakening our power, right? As socialists, we believe that like solidarity is like the ultimate power, right? And like we need to have an institution, an organization to build that power and to keep that power going and go from the defense to the offense. Because I don't know about y'all, but I'm really fucking tired of every Supreme Court session wondering which of my rights are going to get struck down, right? My partner and I want to have children, and that's a very open question whether or not the capitalist state will allow us to do that, right? And like that's not a way for us to live. Right? We are not able to fully develop our lives, fully develop our families, fully develop our bodies, because we're never sure what the capitalist state's going to throw at us. And this is just in like constant within capitalism, because that's how capitalism works, right? Capitalism works by hyper exploiting you and oppressing you. And so when we think about how do we actually protect trans rights, how do we defend trans rights, we have to move from the defense to the offense, right? We need to think about how can we do what we need to do to build ourselves into a movement and an organization that is capable of not just defending against this or that attack, but really trying to bring this whole fucking system down, because that's what we need. Because I don't know about y'all, but I want to live a life where I don't have to worry every couple of years about which of my rights are going to get struck down, right? My partner keeps a list of what states where we can't legally go to, because I would be arrested. You know what I mean? Like that's not a way to live a life. And that's not a way to be a person, right? And so when we say that we need a working class party that fights for socialism, this isn't like a pipe dream. This isn't like, oh, wouldn't it be good at someday to have that? This is like what we think is the key strategic task for us to do right now. What we need to do right now is not only stop fucking with the Democratic Party, that we desperately need to stop fucking with the Democratic Party, but what we really need to do is start to think about how can we build something for ourselves that can still exist even after this current wave of attacks is done. Because that's been the biggest problem with social movements in this country, right? Is that they emerge in moments of acute struggle, and then the news cycle moves on, people have to go back to work, all these things, and they sort of die out, they trickle out, they get repressed, they get co-opted, right? And that's what we started with BLM. And so it's how can we keep that energy going, and how can we keep that energy going against the real enemy, right? There's a saying in the labor movement: a same struggle, same fight. How do we actually put that logic into political reality. And the only way to do that is to form our own organization where we connect and unify all of these struggles against the real enemy, which is the capitalist system, not just in this country, but around the world. And so we need a working class party that's going to fight for socialism both nationally and internationally, because we need to understand that there are so many more of us than there are of them. So why are we letting them control us? I always think about Malcolm X famously said, we're not outnumbered, we're out-organized. So it's time to get organized. Because as we can see, the future doesn't look super peachy keen, right? Rosa Luxemburg said there's going to come a point where we have to choose between socialism and barbarism. And like, I'm not saying that choice is tomorrow, but that choice seems closer than it's been in a minute, between the economy, between the climate, between the rise of the right, all of these things. So are we just going to sit around and wait till that moment and then not be ready? Or are we going to start to get ready? Right? And it's time to start to get ready, which means we need to start building. And we need to think about what we're building, because we need to actually build something that can actually win. Because I'm not doing this for a participation trophy. I'm doing this to win. And what we need to win is a party. And that party needs to be of us, of the working class, of the oppressed, that's fighting not just against individual attacks, but against the whole system. And so we need to fight for a society where we can live and be people and be free. And that's never going to happen under this system.
I think that's a really exciting place to wrap up the discussion. I do, though, want to ask one final, more lighthearted question, since, like we established at the start, we're very excited about this being Pride Month. I want to ask you guys what your favorite piece of queer culture or your favorite queer movie is. I am going to start, and I'm going to give my first answer because I suspect that mine is going to be a little bit less cultured, a little bit less political than your answers. I am not a particularly sophisticated movie watcher. I'm just going to put that out there. My answer is But I'm a Cheerleader. I freaking love that movie. Big Natasha Lyonne fan. One of the few movies I could watch probably over and over and over again. Simply the best. It also features a small RuPaul cameo. So, what are y'all's favorite queer movies?
I only very recently watched this movie, which is a little bit embarrassing, but I have to say Pride, which is a true story about this group in England called Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors, which was a group of people in the 80s who were fighting their own struggle for queer liberation, specifically during the AIDS epidemic. And they saw that these minors were on strike, this like massive strike that was really taxing on the families of the minors, and they were like trying to connect the struggles. And so they went out there and raised a bunch of money and supported them on the picket line. And ultimately the minors were defeated, like they had to go back to work. But then these minors ended up having this great relationship with the Lesbian and Gays Support the Minors, and sort of with the queer community more broadly. And that same year, the minors were at the front of the Pride March and ended up when organizers or members of the queer community who had supported the minors, when they started losing members to AIDS, minors would like attend the funeral. And so there was like this really beautiful connection between what we think of as like the more traditional blue collar working class and the queer community, you know, fighting in each other's battles. And I cried like 6 times when I watched the movie, because I was like, oh my God, labor really can fight for social movement, and vice versa. I was like,
It's
wow,
so
it really
beautiful.
is one struggle, one fight.
I love that movie. It's so beautiful and like so relevant to what we discussed today, for sure.
Yeah, I came in with one prepared, and I'm going to change it up because Reba inspired me. But there's this incredible TV show out of Britain that I think is on HBO in the States, called It's a Sin. That came out a couple years ago. That is just, it follows this group of queer friends through the 80s, and so each episode is like a different year. And it's by Russell T Davies, who is most famous for recreating Doctor Who, and it's sort of loosely autobiographical. And what I think is so powerful about it is that, you know, obviously the AIDS crisis and the AIDS epidemic are so foundational to a lot of the way we talk about queerness, that it becomes this almost like unrelenting tragedy. And I think that when you are queer, especially when you're queer in the current moment that we are in, as we've been discussing, it's really easy to just feel like our entire history is one of tragedy. And what I really love about this miniseries is that, one, it shows like how much joy and how much love there were among these people, which then really sort of underlines the tragedy more, right? And so that when these characters start contracting HIV and passing away, it becomes all the more tragic, and not just tragic but rageful. And that's another thing that's really covered in this, of these like how rage inducing this is, and how like these people were like struck down in their prime. And like in Pride, the lead organizer of Lesbians and Gay Support the Minors, who was this gay communist, died at 27 of HIV, in real life and in the film. And so I think that like It's a Sin really captures the like humanity of the AIDS crisis, and also like the rage of the AIDS crisis. And I think so much of like AIDS content, and so much of sort of historical queer content in general, like teaches you to walk away with like, oh, it's so sad, being gay is so sad, or being queer is so sad. And I think like what the best queer art does is, if it engages with the tragedy of our history or of our current situation, it's about, I think it should be there to make you angry, right? Because like it shouldn't be this way. And I think one of the great tragedies of the AIDS epidemic is how like we lost a generation of activists, of artists, of people, right? And I think It's a Sin really sort of underlines what that is and what that means, and what a like whole this is, and that this was a whole that was created by not just like a random disease, but by deep government like inaction and antipathy and all these things. And so it's very anti-Thatcher, which I always love as well. So yeah, It's a Sin on HBO.
Yeah, antipathy, certainly, yeah, from the Thatcher government, also in the United States from the Reagan government, but also, again, I mean, I feel like we could discuss this for like hours and hours, but also it is definitely not the case that the Democratic Party in the 1980s and 90s were like, standing up for AIDS and people at HIV and things like that.
Can I say just like two quick things on
Please?
So first, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think everyone always likes to forget that it was a Democratic mayor of New York City, Ed Koch, who let those men die. Those queer people, men, trans people, etc., who were literally staging die-ins and dying of HIV on the steps of City Hall, were doing that under a Democratic administration. And the leader of the FDA, who was refusing to investigate, who the AIDS movement burned effigies of, who they protested, was Fauci, who then ends up running the COVID response and becoming this hero to liberalism, just by actively mismanaging the AIDS crisis and letting all these people die. And so I think it's so important to remember, one, that the AIDS generation is not that long ago, that those people are still around, and also that there are like survivors of that era still around. All of our queer elders did not die. Many of them are still here, but also like that the people who killed us in that era are not only still around, but many of them are still in power, right? Joe Biden was in Congress during that era. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't like, it's not like, oh, this weird historical footnote, or, it was a different time. It was a different time insofar as every moment is a different time. It's been incredibly recent, and that happened in many cases in many cities under Democratic administrations. And then they want to turn around and pretend that they are friends. And then Bill Clinton gains power, claims he's a friend to the gay community, and then signs the Defense of Marriage Act and implements Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So like, they're not our friends. They've never been our friends. In 2008, Obama and Clinton couldn't even support gay marriage. You know what I mean? Like, it's just play acting, and they're just play acting because we became popular, and now they're stopping play acting again.
Thank you both for this conversation. This has been super interesting. I will see you on the streets. Pride was a riot, and we are going to go to the Queer Liberation March.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having
us. Thanks, y'all.